I stepped into the living room carrying a small stack of board books and a soft toy for my grandson. I had woken early, as I always did, brewing a pot of coffee, arranging the breakfast table, and folding the napkins just so. Today, I had promised myself a few quiet hours with him, a chance to read, to play, to be present in the little routines that made life feel full and warm. I looked at my son-in-law and said gently, "I can stay and help with him for a few hours while you get ready." He looked up from his phone, eyes flat, expression neutral but cold. "We don't need you," he said. The words hit me like a bucket of ice water, each syllable heavier than the last. My hands froze mid-air, clutching the soft toy as if it could anchor me against the shock. My heart skipped, thudded, and skipped again, hammering loudly in my ears. The room, familiar and filled with sunlight, suddenly seemed alien, hostile. Shadows cast by the morning light fell sharply across the sofa, the scattered toys, the rug, and even the little blocks my grandson had been stacking. I sank onto the edge of the sofa, the weight of 70 years pressing down on me, along with decades of care, patience, and sacrifice. I had cooked, cleaned, read stories, wiped tears, bandaged scraped knees, and soothed nightmares for this family. And yet, in that instant, it was all meaningless. I had been dismissed, erased from the life I had devoted myself to. My grandson, oblivious to the tension, reached for the soft toy in my hands and hummed happily, stacking and knocking over the blocks. The gentle clatter of the toys echoed the sudden collapse inside me. I watched him, feeling a pang of helplessness. He did not understand. He would not understand for many years. But I did. I placed the toy carefully on the floor and let my hands rest on my knees. The silence was thick, charged, almost unbearable. The sun's rays now seemed harsh, slicing across familiar objects and turning the room into something almost unrecognizable. The air felt heavy, almost tactile, pressing against my chest, making each breath deliberate and conscious. I thought of all the mornings I had spent preparing oatmeal and scrambled eggs, the countless cups of milk carefully poured, the endless repetition of brushing teeth, combing hair, and encouraging my grandson to say please and thank you. I had spent years cultivating love, patience, and care, expecting nothing but smiles in return. And yet all of it had been brushed aside. I closed my eyes briefly, feeling the sting of betrayal burn hot in my chest. My lips pressed together, restraining words that threatened to tumble out. I had imagined small disagreements before, perhaps a slight irritation over schedules or chores, but never this. My presence, my love, my devotion, outright rejected. The absurdity of it made my stomach twist, a mixture of disbelief, hurt, and incredulity. I glanced again at my grandson, the little boy absorbed in his blocks, completely unaware that the foundation of his morning had just been shaken. I tried to steady my breathing, slow and deliberate, though the tremor in my hands betrayed me. I had always thought of myself as strong, composed, a steady presence in the house, but now I felt unmoored, as though the ground had shifted beneath me. I remembered the countless times I had read him stories, singing softly while he clutched my hand, the warmth of our routine offering comfort. I thought of evenings spent soothing him to sleep, my own body aching but my heart full, the kind of exhaustion that was rewarding and sacred. And yet none of that mattered now. My role had been questioned, my care dismissed, and my value reduced to a single phrase: "We don't need you." I exhaled slowly, letting a shudder pass through me. I tried to gather myself, to focus, to anchor in the quiet moments. The toys at my feet, the books stacked neatly, the soft hum of the refrigerator, and the ticking of the clock. These ordinary sounds became markers, reminders of life moving on around me, indifferent to my shock. I looked back at my son-in-law, his face unreadable, neutral, yet charged with a casual dismissal that cut sharper than anger ever could. No apology, no recognition of the impact of his words, just certainty. My chest tightened further, the ache spreading down my arms and through my legs. I had never felt so suddenly, so completely invisible. I sat quietly, letting the moment wash over me, trying to process it, trying to hold on to a thread of dignity. I felt the weight of every year pressing down, not just the 70 winters of my own life, but decades of dedication, of love poured into family, into this home. It had all been acknowledged silently, invisibly, and now dismissed. And yet, beneath the shock, beneath the hurt, something stirred. A quiet, simmering determination, the kind that comes with age and experience. I may be 70, I may have been shaken, dismissed, but I was far from powerless. I had watched life unfold, survived losses, nurtured love, and faced challenges before. This was another moment. Painful, yes, but a challenge nonetheless. I picked up the soft toy, feeling its familiar texture, and placed it gently next to my grandson. I straightened my cardigan, took a slow, measured breath, and allowed the silence to settle around me. I didn't speak. I didn't act. Not yet. I let the words of my son-in-law echo in the quiet room, repeated silently in my mind. "We don't need you." It was a rejection, yes, but it was also a spark, and I, 70 years old, was ready to face it. The morning carried on as if nothing had happened. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the sunlight spill across the small backyard. The dog padded softly behind me, tail wagging, oblivious to the tension that still clung to the air. I sipped slowly, trying to steady my heartbeat, letting the warmth of the mug seep into my hands and calm the rapid thrum inside my chest. I reminded myself to breathe, to observe, to be quiet. At 70, I had learned the power of patience, the weight of measured action. Yet this was different. Something in the house had shifted, subtle but unmistakable. I could feel it in the way the blinds tilted in the morning light, in the hum of the refrigerator, in the distant sounds of the neighbors' lawnmowers. Everything ordinary felt off-kilter. I stood and moved to the kitchen, arranging the dishes I had set aside the night before. Cups clinked softly as I stacked them on the drying rack, a simple, repetitive motion to center myself. But even these small tasks couldn't mask the sense of unease. I noticed the faint smudge on the counter, a detail I would have ignored before, and the half-open drawer in the dining room where the family kept paperwork. My eyes lingered there, a flicker of doubt igniting inside me. Something was not right. My grandson ran in, his tiny socks sliding on the tile. He grabbed my hand, tugging me toward the living room with the boundless energy of a child, unconcerned by adult conflicts. I smiled at him, hiding the anxiety that pressed against my ribs. His innocence was a balm, and yet it also sharpened the sting. The world he inhabited was meant to be safe, predictable, filled with the warmth of family. But that world, I realized, was fragile, and I was now unsure of my place in it. I brewed a second pot of coffee, the aroma grounding me in the present. I observed my son and daughter-in-law from the kitchen doorway. My son moved about efficiently, preparing his work bag, tying his tie with practiced ease. He smiled briefly at his wife, who was scrolling through her phone, lips pursed, fingers tapping with precision. I caught a flash of tension in her jaw, a subtle narrowing of the eyes as she glanced in my direction. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but my instincts told me it was there. I busied myself with breakfast, preparing eggs, toast, and fruit, placing them carefully on the table. I tried to ignore the gnawing sensation in my stomach, a low, persistent awareness that something beneath the surface was off. I had known their moods, their habits, the rhythms of this household for decades. But today, the rhythms felt dissonant, almost artificial. There was a subtle sharpness in the way they spoke, a clipped efficiency that carried an edge I could not ignore. I cleaned the counter, wiped down the coffee machine, and organized the pantry. I told myself it was nothing, just a misreading, an overreaction brought on by the sting of rejection. But the small details accumulated like breadcrumbs. The dishes left slightly askew, the folded napkins not perfectly aligned, the brief, darting looks between my son and his wife that stopped when I entered the room. My mind cataloged each observation, filing them away silently, methodically, as I had always done in life. I sat down finally, pouring a fresh cup of coffee, and let my eyes wander over the photographs lining the living room walls. There we were. Family portraits, snapshots of birthdays, vacations, holidays. Each image is a testament to years of shared experience and love. And yet today, I felt like an intruder in these memories, a ghost wandering through a space that no longer welcomed me. The little routines that had once comforted me, feeding the dog, checking the mailbox, watering the potted plants, now seemed like a delicate mask, a veneer of normalcy covering a tension that could not be ignored. I noticed the mail was left slightly out of place, the bills were unopened, and the checkbook was shifted. My pulse quickened, a subtle alarm ringing in my chest. Something was happening behind the calm facade, and I could feel it, even if I could not yet name it. I reached for my grandson's hand again, feeling the warmth of his tiny fingers. He giggled, spinning around, and I let myself smile, though my mind raced. I thought of the conversation earlier, of the words that had cut deeper than any physical pain. "We don't need you." They replayed in my mind, a mantra I could not shake. I knew now that this morning, as ordinary as it seemed, was the calm before a storm. I moved quietly through the house, checking the rooms, noticing the subtle signs, a jacket left on the sofa where it didn't belong, the faint scent of perfume, not my own, lingering in the hallway. A book moved slightly from its usual place. Each tiny deviation was a clue, a whisper that all was not as it seemed. I recorded them in my mind, like a detective cataloging the scene before a crime. I took another sip of coffee, trying to steady the unease gnawing at me. The dog nudged my knee, and I stroked its head, grateful for the grounding presence. I glanced at the clock. Time moved with a deceptive normality, even as the undercurrent of tension thickened. I knew I had to observe, to wait, to collect information. There was no acting rashly, no confronting blindly. At 70, I had learned the value of patience, of subtlety, of planning. By the time the morning sun had climbed higher, spilling more light into the rooms, I had cataloged the anomalies, committed the nuances to memory. The household moved around me as if nothing had happened, but I was acutely aware of the fractures beneath the surface. Today, I realized, nothing was ordinary anymore. The calm was only temporary, a deceptive peace before the inevitable upheaval. I settled into my chair, notebook at hand, pen ready. Every glance, every tone of voice, every small shift in behavior would be recorded, cataloged, and analyzed. I would need this. I did not doubt that the coming days would test my presence, my patience, my very role in this family. But I was ready. I had to be. The calm before the storm was just the beginning, and I, 70 years old, was preparing myself to face whatever was coming. The morning had passed with the deceptive calm of routine. My grandson was happily stacking blocks, the dog napping in the corner, the sunlight spilling across the floor in a way that made everything seem ordinary. But something in the air felt heavy, charged, like the stillness before a storm. I could sense it in the subtle movements of my son and daughter-in-law, the glances they exchanged, the slight stiffening of shoulders, the way words were clipped, precise, almost rehearsed. I tried to dismiss it at first, telling myself it was just my imagination, a leftover sting from the morning's rejection. But the unease persisted, growing heavier with each passing minute. I noticed my son leaning closer to his wife while she scrolled through her phone, lowering her voice whenever she spoke. The gestures were small, almost imperceptible, but to me they were flashes of a hidden world I was not meant to see. As I poured a fresh cup of coffee, my phone buzzed on the counter. I picked it up instinctively. A message from my daughter-in-law. "Mom, don't interfere. Just let us handle things." My hands trembled slightly as I read the words. My heart sank, a slow, heavy ache that spread through my chest. The calm had dissolved entirely. This was more than a casual dismissal. It was a warning, a barrier, a subtle, insidious push to remove me from influence. My mind raced, cataloging every previous slight, every small exclusion over the past weeks. The breadcrumbs were there all along. Now they were forming a trail that I could no longer ignore. I set the phone down and took a deep breath. My eyes scanned the living room, taking in every detail. The blocks toppled slightly to the side, the toy bear lying on its back, the sunlight slanting across the carpet, creating sharp contrasts between light and shadow. The ordinary had been disrupted. Even my grandson's laughter, sweet and innocent, rang strangely, almost discordant, as if highlighting the abnormality around me. I walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street. Neighbors were tending gardens, mowing lawns, chatting in clipped tones, oblivious to the tension building inside my house. Yet I could feel it, the disturbance, crawling along the edges of perception. The familiar sounds, the ticking clock, the low hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the floorboards now seemed amplified, a backdrop to the undercurrent of something wrong, something deliberate. I decided to observe more closely, pretending normalcy while noting anomalies. My son sat down at the kitchen table with a newspaper, pretending to read. His eyes flicked briefly to his wife, then to me, and I caught the tiniest smirk, quickly suppressed. My daughter-in-law was scrolling through her phone again, fingers flying over the screen, lips pressed tight. I noticed a faint crease between her eyebrows, a tension that disappeared the moment I looked directly at her. These small, fleeting gestures spoke volumes. Something was happening that I had been deliberately kept unaware of. I returned to my grandson, kneeling beside him and helping him build a tower. My hands were steady, but my mind was not. Every block I placed felt like a small anchor, a reminder of what I had built in this family. Not just the toys, but the trust, the care, the presence I had devoted decades to maintaining. And yet, I was being subtly pushed aside, systematically excluded, warned away from involvement. The phone buzzed again. Another message. My daughter-in-law's words were clipped, almost curt. "Mom, just stay out of it, trust me." I felt a shiver run through me. Trust. The word was hollow, a veneer of civility masking an underlying exclusion, a manipulation. I wondered how long this had been brewing, how much of their behavior had been genuine affection, and how much carefully crafted distance. The ordinary world around me, the laughter, the light, the warmth of my grandson's small hand, now felt like a fragile stage behind which something darker played out. I decided I would not react impulsively. At 70, I knew the value of patience and careful observation. I would watch, note, catalog, and record every subtle shift, every glance, every movement, every word. This disturbance, small as it seemed, was a signal. It was the first visible crack in the facade, and I needed to understand it fully before taking any action. I poured myself another cup of coffee, the steam rising in a gentle spiral, grounding me. I watched my grandson trying to mask the tension in my body. His innocence, his laughter, was a small tether to sanity, a reminder of why I needed to be calm and deliberate. I could not let my emotions betray me. This was no longer just a minor annoyance or a casual dismissal. It was a pattern emerging, subtle, systematic, and deliberate. I moved quietly around the house, checking small details I might have missed earlier. A book was slightly out of place. A pen lay askew on the counter. The newspaper had been folded differently than the night before. Every small anomaly added to the growing sense that the ordinary rhythm of the house had been carefully disrupted, and I was being deliberately excluded. By mid-morning, I had compiled a mental list of discrepancies, gestures, and messages. I knew I needed more evidence, more observation, more clarity. The calm had passed entirely. The disturbance was real, deliberate, and potentially dangerous to my position in this family. I would need to act carefully, patiently, and strategically, documenting everything. I would watch and wait as the storm that had begun with a single phrase, "We don't need you," quietly gathered strength. Sitting back in my chair, I let out a slow, measured breath. My grandson played at my feet, the sunlight still streaming through the window, and I reminded myself, this was only the beginning. The ordinary morning, the routine tasks, the familiar environment, none of it would remain ordinary for long. I, 70 years old, would observe, prepare, and respond. The disturbance had arrived, and I would not be caught unready. The day dragged on, each moment stretching longer than the last. My grandson played quietly at his little table, blocks scattered across the floor, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background. But I could no longer focus solely on the routine. Something had shifted, and my instincts, honed by 70 years of observing the world and the people around me, were screaming that the ordinary was only a carefully maintained illusion. I began to notice details, small inconsistencies that had previously passed without thought. The pen my daughter-in-law had used to sign a note the day before was not the one she usually preferred. The signature, neat but slightly off, carried a subtle hesitation in the strokes, a signal that something had been written under pressure or in secrecy. My eyes, sharpened by years of noticing the subtlest changes, caught the difference immediately. Then there was the way she moved around the house, always precise, always deliberate. But today the movements felt rehearsed, calculated. She would pause just long enough at the counter or the bookshelf for a subtle glance at my direction, then continue as if nothing had happened. And the glances between her and my son, they were brief, almost imperceptible. But there was a weight there, a shared understanding that I was not meant to notice. My pulse quickened with each observation, my mind cataloging and storing every tiny detail. I noticed another small thing in the living room. The family photo on the mantelpiece was slightly askew, just a fraction to the right. I had straightened it only yesterday, and I knew that no one else in the household cared enough to adjust it. My fingers itched to move it back, to restore order, but I paused. That slight shift, trivial to most, was another clue. Something was being manipulated, subtly, deliberately, behind my back. I moved quietly into the hallway, observing her footprints in the carpet, the soft shuffle of her socks as she walked across the tiles. The faint scent of a perfume I didn't recognize lingered in the air, delicate and fleeting, but unmistakable. Every detail whispered that the morning's calm was a mask, that the household's ordinary routines were carefully choreographed, designed to exclude me. As I carried a tray of juice and snacks to the table, I kept my eyes alert. A stack of mail lay slightly askew on the counter, bills, letters, and documents I had not placed there. The checkbook was open, the pen beside it not the usual blue ink I had kept for our family records. My mind began connecting dots that were scattered, seemingly random, yet forming a pattern. The ordinary, the familiar, was no longer reliable. I returned to the living room and crouched beside my grandson. His laughter was soft, unaware of the tension in the house, his small fingers patting the blocks in a gentle rhythm. I smiled at him, hiding the unease twisting in my stomach. But every time I glanced at my son or daughter-in-law, I felt the current of deception running beneath the surface, subtle and hidden, yet undeniable. Then I noticed the calendar on the wall, the one I had hung and updated personally. A small note had been added in my absence, the handwriting unfamiliar, precise, almost mechanical. It was minor, trivial, but in my experience, trivialities often concealed intention. My mind raced, trying to account for each anomaly, each irregularity. This was no longer just a feeling. It was evidence. I walked quietly to the kitchen to refill my coffee cup, trying to anchor myself in routine, to mask the tension growing inside. But even there, inconsistencies emerged. A jar of sugar had been moved. A napkin had been folded differently than usual. I could feel the pulse of careful planning behind these small changes. Each adjustment meant to manipulate perception, to maintain a veneer of normalcy while hiding a truth I was just beginning to suspect. The texts I had received earlier replayed in my mind. "Mom, don't interfere. Just let us handle things." I realize now they were not casual dismissals. They were strategic, warning me to step aside, to trust a facade I could see through. My grandson tugged gently at my sleeve, and I held his hand, feeling the contrast between his innocence and the deception surrounding me. It strengthened my resolve, reminding me why I needed clarity, observation, and careful documentation. I began to catalog every inconsistency: the altered signature, the shifted photo, the unusual perfume, the notes on the calendar, the rearranged mail. My mental list grew longer by the hour, each anomaly reinforcing a single truth. Something deliberate, orchestrated, and hidden was happening in my own household. The calm before the storm was over. The disturbance had grown into suspicion, and I was determined to understand it fully before acting. By mid-afternoon, I had moved systematically from room to room, noting each irregularity, each subtle behavior. I realized the ordinary environment, sunlight, laughter, the hum of appliances, was a stage, and I was now acutely aware of the performance. I would observe. I would record. I would prepare. Every gesture, every word, every shadow could be a clue, a thread leading to the hidden truth I was determined to uncover. Sitting back with my notebook, I felt the weight of both age and experience pressing down. 70 years had taught me patience, caution, and observation. The patterns were emerging now, faint but clear. I could not act yet, not impulsively. The storm was coming, and I needed to be ready, fully aware, fully prepared to respond with the precision and calm that 70 years of life had instilled in me. The house seemed quiet again, but the unease lingered, wrapping around me like a shadow. My grandson's laughter, the dog's soft snores, the sunlight spilling across the floor, they were all normal, ordinary elements masking the tension that had grown invisible only to those not paying attention. I was paying attention. I would not be blindsided. The details did not match. The calm had ended. And now, the true work of observation and eventual action would begin. By the late afternoon, the house had settled into its deceptive rhythm once more. My grandson had wandered off to nap, the dog curled in a sunlit corner, and the hum of appliances filled the quiet. On the surface, everything appeared calm, but inside me, a storm was building, swirling thoughts and suspicions that refused to settle. I sank into my chair, notebook on my lap, pen poised. I had always believed in observing first, acting later, but the inconsistencies of the day gnawed at me. Every glance between my son and his wife, every misplaced object, every altered note felt deliberate. They were small, seemingly insignificant actions, but to me, each was a thread in a hidden tapestry, carefully woven to exclude me, to manipulate perception, to control the household from the shadows. I thought of the messages I had received earlier. "Mom, don't interfere. Just let us handle things." I had tried to dismiss them at first, labeling them as dismissive or rude, but now they read differently. They were warnings, veiled threats, a quiet command to step aside. My heart sank, a heavy, leaden weight pressing against my ribs. At 70, I had learned patience and perspective, but patience required observation, and perspective demanded awareness. I opened the notebook and began listing every anomaly I had noticed in the past days and weeks. The altered signature, The misplaced books, the faint, unfamiliar scent of perfume, the calendar notes added without my knowledge, the brief, deliberate glances, all catalogued meticulously. I noted the time, the room, the context. Each small detail added to a growing narrative I could no longer ignore. I paused, pen hovering over the page, and allowed myself to feel the betrayal in full. This was not just casual rudeness. This was a carefully orchestrated exclusion. My years of devotion, raising my grandson, supporting my son, keeping the household steady, were being disregarded, dismissed, and manipulated. The sting of betrayal cut deep, sharper than I had anticipated, yet beneath it burned a quiet determination. I refused to be cast aside silently. My mind replayed every interaction with my daughter-in-law, scanning for patterns, searching for motive. There were moments she had subtly undermined me, dismissed my advice, or insisted on doing things her way. Every one of these instances, which I had once shrugged off in the name of family harmony, now seemed calculated, part of a plan I had barely glimpsed. The realization made my chest tighten, a mixture of fear and resolve coursing through me. I reflected on my son's behavior as well. He had been gentle, polite, almost oblivious at times, but I could sense his complicity in the small manipulations. Whether intentional or passive, his actions had contributed to the environment in which I was marginalized. My instinct told me he trusted his wife more than he trusted me, or perhaps he simply didn't notice the impact of their combined behavior. I let the pen glide across the page, writing questions I needed answers to. Who benefits from excluding me? What are they trying to control? What have I overlooked? Each question opened a door to a deeper understanding, but also a heavier weight of doubt. The safe, ordinary morning, the routines I had depended on for decades, had become uncertain, unstable. I recalled a small argument from a week ago, subtle at the time, almost forgettable. My daughter-in-law had brushed past me, a sharp tone in her voice about the grocery list, a subtle insinuation that I was unnecessary in household decisions. At the time, I had dismissed it, attributing it to stress or fatigue. But now, viewed in the context of today's events, it seemed like a signal, an early move in a strategy that had been quietly developing. I took a sip of my coffee, the warmth grounding me, but the bitterness matched the tightening knot in my stomach. I felt an overwhelming mixture of sadness, disbelief, and anger. I had nurtured this family with unwavering care, yet my place, my influence, my love, all of it, was being minimized and manipulated. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, but it also lit a spark of resolve. I returned to the living room, notebook in hand, and watched my grandson sleep, small and trusting, unaware of the tension that surrounded him. The contrast between his innocence and the deception brewing around me made the betrayal feel heavier, more urgent. I needed clarity, observation, and evidence. I needed to understand the patterns before taking any action. I began cataloging the ways my daughter-in-law had subtly manipulated interactions, controlling conversations, intercepting requests, redirecting attention, and creating subtle divisions between me and my son. Each entry in my notebook deepened my understanding, but also intensified my internal conflict. How had I missed these signs before? How had I allowed them to erode my presence without noticing? The questions looped in my mind, relentless, like the ticking of a clock counting down to inevitable confrontation. The dog stirred at my feet, and I stroked its fur, letting its warmth anchor me. I closed my eyes for a brief moment and exhaled, releasing tension while steeling myself for what was to come. The ordinary world of the house, the sunlight, the furniture, the quiet, was now an observation stage, a theater of subtle manipulation. And I, 70 years old, was determined to see it clearly, record it meticulously, and respond wisely. By evening, I had filled several pages of notes, a growing dossier of anomalies, behaviors, and inconsistencies. My mind was sharper, my awareness heightened, and my resolve solidifying. I understood now that the calm mornings, the routines, the gentle appearances of normalcy, they were all misleading. Beneath the surface, a quiet battle for control was unfolding, and I would not be sidelined. Sitting back in my chair, I allowed a long, deliberate breath to pass. The house seemed peaceful again, the shadows lengthening as the sun dipped lower. But I knew better. The disturbance had become suspicion. Suspicion was growing into certainty, and certainty would demand action. The storm had not yet broken, but I was preparing. Every inconsistency, every glance, every small shift in behavior had been cataloged and memorized. I was watching, waiting, and I would not be blindsided. The ordinary, familiar environment, the laughter of my grandson, the hum of appliances, the warmth of the late afternoon sun, was merely the calm before the inevitable confrontation. I, 70 years old, had begun to see clearly, and the inner conflict, the tension, and the doubt would shape the strategy I was about to enact. The family I had nurtured was quietly fracturing, and I would be ready when the truth could no longer be ignored. The next morning, the house seemed deceptively calm. My grandson was at the breakfast table, eating cereal with concentration, the dog padding around us quietly. The sunlight spilled in through the kitchen window, warming the tiles, and for a moment, everything appeared ordinary. But I knew better. The inconsistencies I had observed yesterday, the small shifts in behavior, and the subtle manipulations of my daughter-in-law and son, all of it had not been imagination. I had seen it, cataloged it, and now I needed confirmation from someone else. I poured a cup of coffee, the warmth anchoring me, and tried to focus on the ordinary routines, the hum of the refrigerator, the clatter of spoons against bowls, the soft rustle of newspaper pages. Yet the tension in my chest remained, a steady reminder that beneath this ordinary morning, something was off, deliberate, and carefully concealed. I decided to reach out. I called Mrs. Henderson, our neighbor who had known our family for decades. Her voice was warm but curious when she answered. I asked casually, almost offhand, if she had noticed anything unusual in the house lately, anything that seemed out of place. There was a pause on the other end. Then she said softly but with certainty, "Now that you mention it, yes. I've noticed your daughter-in-law acting strangely. There were a few times she came and went at odd hours, and she seemed to be whispering when she thought no one could hear. And your son, he's been unusually quiet, distracted, almost tense." I listened carefully, noting the inflection in her voice. Her observations were consistent with what I had seen. A growing thread of reality began to take shape, confirming that the irregularities I had cataloged were part of a pattern. Later that morning, the housekeeper knocked lightly at my door. She had been with our family for years and was a trusted presence, discreet and observant. I invited her in, offering coffee as I did when we talked about everyday matters. Carefully, gently, I asked if she had noticed any unusual behavior recently, anything that seemed secretive or deliberately hidden. Her eyes widened slightly and she nodded. "Mrs. Thompson, I've seen some things," she said. "There have been moments when your daughter-in-law moved things around, documents, papers, always subtle, always just out of reach, and she's been very insistent about handling money and decisions without consulting anyone else. I didn't want to worry you, but—" She paused, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. I felt a quiet surge of validation, a subtle relief mingled with a renewed sense of urgency. These confirmations from people outside my immediate observation meant that my suspicions were not paranoia. They were real, deliberate, and actionable. I jotted notes in my notebook as she spoke, recording every detail, the subtle document movements, the insistence on control, the whispered conversations. After the housekeeper left, I walked through the living room, glancing at the scattered toys, the sunlight falling across the carpet, the photo frames on the mantelpiece. Each ordinary object now carried significance, a potential clue, a marker of patterns I had already begun to trace. I thought about the combination of small behaviors and external confirmation. It all painted a picture of deliberate manipulation and exclusion. The messages from my daughter-in-law replayed in my mind. "Mom, don't interfere. Just let us handle things." Now, with Mrs. Henderson's observations and the housekeeper's testimony, these words seemed like part of a larger strategy. They were not casual instructions. They were a prelude, an attempt to remove me from influence and control. I sat at the kitchen table, notebook open, pen in hand, and began cross-referencing the details I had observed personally with those confirmed by others. Timestamps, behaviors, documents, movements, all aligned into a subtle but unmistakable pattern. I realized that this was not just a minor manipulation. It was an orchestrated attempt to undermine my role in the household, to exclude me from decisions, to marginalize my presence. My grandson played nearby, unaware of the tension, his laughter a brief grounding note in the otherwise charged atmosphere. I reached down to touch his shoulder lightly, letting him know I was near, while mentally preparing the next steps. Observation alone would not be enough. Confirmation had given me clarity, and clarity required action. I reviewed every interaction from the past days, the misaligned calendar notes, the altered signatures, the subtle glances, the whispered instructions, and now these confirmations from trusted witnesses. Each small piece reinforced the truth I had been building. My daughter-in-law was systematically attempting to control, exclude, and manipulate. By late morning, I had compiled a small dossier of evidence, mental and written, cataloging anomalies, witness statements, and patterns. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the warmth fill me, anchoring me to patience and focus. I could feel the weight of 70 years, not as a limitation, but as a source of wisdom, of measured strength and resolve. The ordinary morning had ended. The calm that once masked the disturbances had dissipated. With external confirmation, the picture was clear. I could no longer ignore the pattern, and I could no longer act passively. Observation, evidence, and patience. These would be my tools. The next steps would require careful planning, strategic action, and unwavering resolve. Sitting back, I allowed a long, steady breath to pass through me. The house remained outwardly serene, my grandson playing, the sunlight warm on the floor. But beneath that calm lay an unmistakable truth. I was no longer alone in seeing it. Others had noticed, and now, with confirmation, I was ready to prepare for the actions that would inevitably follow. The storm was approaching, and I would not be unprepared. By late afternoon, I could no longer remain a passive observer. The confirmation from Mrs. Henderson and the housekeeper had solidified what I already suspected. Something deliberate was unfolding in my own household, and I needed to act. I was 70 years old, yes, but that age had taught me patience, careful observation, and the value of strategy. Now it was time to put those lessons into practice. I began in the living room, notebook and pen in hand, systematically reviewing the anomalies I had cataloged over the past few days. Every misplaced document, every shifted calendar note, every subtle glance between my son and his wife. It all had to be recorded. I wrote down the time, the room, the context, even the tiniest expressions or gestures. Patterns were emerging, and I intended to make them undeniable. Next, I moved to the kitchen desk where the family kept bills, mail, and financial papers. I carefully examined the documents, noting which had been moved or handled differently than usual. I opened the checkbook to review past transactions, cross-referencing amounts and dates. Some things seemed ordinary at first glance, but my instincts told me that the smallest inconsistencies could indicate manipulation, misdirection, or hidden activity. I also began observing behavior more deliberately. When my daughter-in-law left the room, I would note the time she spent away, any sudden movements or subtle interactions with my son, even changes in her phone activity. I memorized the patterns, noting deviations that might indicate secretive communication or hidden plans. I decided to take additional precautions. I set up a small notebook on a side table to track daily events, creating a chronological log. Each entry included the time, who was present, what was said, and what had been moved or altered. Every detail counted: a document slightly out of place, a misplaced book, a note folded differently than usual. I cataloged these anomalies meticulously, like an investigator building a case. The more I documented, the clearer the picture became. The calm, ordinary routines were nothing more than a carefully maintained facade, a stage upon which my daughter-in-law and son performed to conceal their intentions. I reminded myself, this was not paranoia. The confirmations I had received from trusted witnesses ensured that the anomalies were real, deliberate, and purposeful. By evening, I had completed an initial survey of the house, reviewing every room, every corner, and every document I could access. I cross-referenced my observations with the reports from the housekeeper and Mrs. Henderson. Each overlap reinforced the conclusion I had been arriving at slowly but surely. This was not incidental. My daughter-in-law was systematically attempting to manipulate, control, and marginalize me within the household. I made a plan for the next day. I would continue observing quietly, taking careful notes without revealing my awareness. I would track movements, record anomalies, and begin discreetly gathering evidence. My actions needed to be deliberate, measured, and invisible. I had learned over 70 years that timing was everything. A misstep now could ruin the advantage I was slowly securing. I returned to my grandson, now finishing a drawing at the small table. I knelt beside him, gently smoothing a curl from his forehead. "You're doing a great job," I said softly. He smiled, entirely unaware of the calculations and observations I was performing in my mind. His innocence grounded me, reminding me why I needed to approach this carefully. I could not let emotion dictate action. I had to act with precision. The dog padded over and nudged my knee, seeking attention. I stroked its fur, taking a slow breath and allowing myself a brief moment of calm. But the sense of urgency never left me. I reviewed the sequence in my mind: observation, documentation, verification, and careful intervention. Each step would be methodical, leaving no room for error or misjudgment. I also reflected on my daughter-in-law's messages. "Mom, don't interfere. Just let us handle things." Their meaning was now clearer than ever. They were not casual dismissals. They were early signals of a plan to exclude me, to consolidate control. I could no longer ignore them, nor could I act without preparation. Every detail I had collected would serve as evidence, supporting a strategy I was beginning to formulate. By the time the sun had dipped below the horizon, I had completed a detailed record of the day's events, including behaviors, anomalies, and small inconsistencies. My notes were meticulous. Times, locations, and observed actions were carefully logged. I had begun building the foundation for what I intended to do next. Sitting back in my chair, I allowed myself a measured sigh. The house appeared peaceful. My grandson's laughter from the playroom, the dog's soft snores, the glow of the evening sun filtering through the blinds. Yet I knew better. The calm was deceptive. Beneath it, a careful orchestration was unfolding, and I was now fully aware of it. I closed my notebook, pausing to center myself. At 70, I had the patience, experience, and clarity to turn observation into action. The first steps had been taken: documenting, verifying, and understanding the scope of what was occurring. Tomorrow, I would continue, expanding the investigation, identifying patterns, and preparing to reclaim the influence and presence that had been quietly challenged. The first action had been made. The storm was approaching, and I would meet it, prepared, deliberate, and fully aware. I was not powerless, not passive, and certainly not unaware. 70 years of life had taught me to see, to understand, and to act with precision. the household could no longer operate in secrecy. I would illuminate the patterns, step by step, until the truth was undeniable. The following morning, I set out with the determination I had cultivated over 70 years. My grandson was safely at preschool, and the house was quiet for the first time since the disturbance began. I had prepared myself for a day of careful observation, methodical tracking, and subtle evidence gathering. Every step I took was deliberate, measured, and calculated. I had learned over the decades that patience and attention to detail could unearth truths that were otherwise invisible. I began in the living room, scanning the area for any signs of movement or hidden documents that might have been overlooked. My eyes landed on a slight shift in the corner of the room, where a small stack of papers lay, not in the usual order. I crouched down and examined them closely. Receipts, bills, and notes I did not recognize were interspersed with familiar documents. A small, folded envelope peeked out from beneath the stack. Its handwriting was precise, unfamiliar, and deliberate. My pulse quickened. This was not ordinary oversight. It was intentional. I carefully picked up the envelope and opened it, keeping my hands steady. Inside were financial documents I had not authorized, including account summaries and recent transactions that had bypassed my usual oversight. A subtle tightening of the chest reminded me of the stakes at hand. My daughter-in-law was quietly diverting funds, manipulating resources, and attempting to control elements of the household without my knowledge. Every detail aligned with the patterns I had been observing for days. I took meticulous notes in my notebook, recording every document, every figure, and every timestamp. I compared them to previous records, noting discrepancies and irregularities. Even the smallest differences, dates slightly off, amounts rounded differently, handwriting inconsistent, told a story of deliberate action. I felt a thrill of clarity. The fragments I had collected over the past week were converging into a coherent narrative. Next, I moved to the home office, where my daughter-in-law frequently spent hours on her laptop. I had noticed subtle behaviors during prior observations, late-night logins, hushed phone conversations, and unusual file movements. I sat quietly at a corner desk, pretending to read a magazine while my eyes swept the room, noting every detail. A drawer, slightly ajar, caught my attention. Inside were receipts and notes that had not been shared with the rest of the family. My suspicion was confirmed. She was actively concealing financial actions. I carefully documented each item, photographing notes with my phone where appropriate so as to preserve a record. Every image, every note became a puzzle piece, another clue pointing to her intention to manipulate, control, and marginalize me within the household. The reality I had suspected for weeks was now undeniable. I moved to the backyard next, following a subtle pattern I had noticed during prior observations. Constructions, tool sheds, and small outdoor areas had been subtly accessed, cleaned, or rearranged in ways that suggested my daughter-in-law had been creating a controlled environment, one that I was expected to accept without question. My mind raced, noting the effort, the calculation, and the deliberate orchestration behind each movement. As I continued my careful sweep, I discovered a small notebook hidden behind a row of potted plants, a detail I had almost overlooked. Flipping through it, I found entries documenting minor household expenditures, times when I had been excluded from decision-making, and notes about my grandson's schedule. Each entry, innocuous on the surface, carried the weight of intentional omission and control. I realized that she had been preparing this record to consolidate her authority, to ensure I could not intervene or challenge her actions. I paused, allowing the weight of the discoveries to settle. The calm facade of the house had crumbled under the scrutiny of careful observation. What had once appeared ordinary, the hum of appliances, the sunlight streaming through the windows, the quiet rhythm of daily life, was now a stage upon which deliberate manipulation had been performed. I had gathered the first tangible evidence, and it was damning. I carefully collected the documents, notes, and photographs, organizing them systematically in my notebook and a small folder. Every detail mattered. Every small irregularity, every subtle act of omission or concealment would serve as proof when the time came to confront and reclaim control. I reminded myself to remain patient, to maintain discretion, and to act strategically. By mid-afternoon, I had reconstructed a timeline of activities and identified several key moments when my daughter-in-law had acted without oversight, diverting funds, concealing decisions, and marginalizing my role. I cross-referenced these findings with my earlier observations and the confirmations I had received from Mrs. Henderson and the housekeeper. Each piece reinforced the others, creating a mosaic of deliberate, orchestrated action. I took a moment to breathe, feeling both exhaustion and satisfaction. The storm was coming, but I now had the tools to understand it, document it, and prepare to respond. The first step of discovery had been accomplished, and the evidence I had gathered would serve as the foundation for the actions I would take to restore balance and assert my rightful place in the household. Sitting quietly in the backyard, I let my thoughts settle while reviewing the notebook, photographs and notes I had collected. My grandson would return soon, and the ordinary life would resume, at least outwardly. But I was no longer passive. I had seen, documented, and understood the hidden maneuvers. I was ready. The household could no longer operate in secrecy. I, 70 years old, had discovered the clues, and the next steps would be deliberate, precise, and effective. The morning was crisp, sunlight spilling through the blinds in long, slanted stripes across the floor. I moved quietly through the house, notebook in hand, each step deliberate. My grandson was busy with his toys, humming softly to himself, entirely unaware of the tension simmering in the air. Even the dog seemed to sense my focus, padding silently beside me. Today, I was not merely observing, I was searching. I started in the living room, scanning every surface, every corner. The photo frames, once ordinary decorations, now felt like markers. I noticed the slight shift of a picture on the mantel, a detail that had escaped me the day before. A signature on a bill on the side table didn't match her usual handwriting. My heart quickened. These weren't isolated anomalies. They were pieces of a larger puzzle. Threads I had to follow. I moved to the desk where the family kept important papers. Carefully, I opened the drawers, noting the placement of documents, bills, and checkbooks. A folder that had always been tucked neatly in the back was now slightly ajar. I reached for it with steady hands, my fingers brushing the edges of its contents. Inside, I found receipts and statements that didn't add up. Unexpected withdrawals, transfers to accounts I had never seen, and notes in handwriting that was not my son's. I sat down on the edge of the sofa, notebook open, pen ready. I began cataloging everything in detail. The document, the date, the amount, the context. Each entry built a clearer picture of deliberate action, manipulation, and concealment. My daughter-in-law's influence was more extensive than I had suspected. She had been systematically redirecting resources, isolating me from financial decisions, and subtly asserting control. Next, I decided to follow her movements more closely. I pretended to busy myself in the kitchen while keeping a careful eye on her. She left the room quietly, phone in hand, moving toward the study. I trailed a few steps behind, careful not to make my presence known. She opened a drawer, retrieved a small envelope, and slid it into her bag. The action was brief, practiced, casual, but to me, it screamed secrecy. I jotted the time in my notebook, 9:42 a.m. Then I followed her silently down the hallway, noting the rooms she visited and the items she touched. She paused briefly by the bookshelf, fingers brushing over files, then moved on. I could see her phone vibrating in her hand, the screen briefly illuminating her face as she glanced down. Another quick note in my journal: potential communication or coordination taking place outside my knowledge. Returning to the living room, I examined the envelope she had taken. My instincts told me it contained something important: documents, receipts, or plans she intended to hide. I made a mental note to track its contents indirectly through observation until I could secure it without confrontation. The pieces were slowly coming together. I reviewed the anomalies I had documented over the past week: altered calendar notes, subtle glances, misaligned photos, shifted documents, unusual handwriting, and now the secretive envelope. Each pattern pointed to a deliberate effort to control, manipulate, and exclude me. I realized with growing certainty that my presence, my authority, and even my influence over my grandson were being undermined in a systematic way. By mid-morning, I had compiled a small dossier of observations. I could see patterns emerging, small but unmistakable. The envelope, the altered documents, the behaviors, all suggested a coordinated attempt to isolate me from decision-making. My daughter-in-law had underestimated me, assuming that my age would make me passive, compliant, or oblivious. She was wrong. I took a deep breath, letting the warmth of the morning sun fill my lungs. I felt a mixture of shock, anger, and determination. The discovery of these hidden actions confirmed that my suspicions were correct and that my next steps had to be deliberate and strategic. I would need to gather further evidence, but I now knew what I was looking for: hidden accounts, unauthorized transactions, withheld documents, and any communication intended to conceal her influence. I returned to the kitchen, notebook in hand, and sipped coffee slowly. My grandson played quietly nearby, and I allowed myself a brief smile at his innocence. But beneath that calm, my mind was sharp, cataloging every detail I had observed, preparing for the next move. The calm before the confrontation had ended. The discovery phase had begun, and I was ready to chase every hidden clue until the full picture was revealed. By the afternoon, I had mapped out her daily patterns, noting times, locations, and behaviors with meticulous care. Every movement, every envelope, every subtle gesture was a piece of the puzzle. I realized that patience and observation were my greatest allies. At 70, I had lived long enough to know that preparation was everything. Acting too soon or too hastily could jeopardize the clarity I had worked to achieve. I looked around the house, sunlight now slanting lower through the windows. The ordinary routines, the laughter of my grandson, the dog's soft snores, the quiet ticking of the clock, were merely the backdrop for my investigation. Everything I had observed, every detail I had cataloged, was evidence, and I would use it wisely. I returned to my chair, pen poised over the notebook. The envelope, the altered documents, the subtle gestures. They all pointed to one undeniable truth. My daughter-in-law had underestimated me. The storm was approaching, but I was no longer passive. I had discovered the first concrete evidence of her manipulation, and now, with careful planning, I would uncover the rest. I watched my grandson for a moment, his small hands arranging blocks, his laughter innocent and unaware. The contrast was stark. The innocence of a child and the deception unfolding in the household around him. I drew a slow breath, committing every observation to memory, every detail to my notes. The chase for the hidden clues had begun, and I, 70 years old, would not stop until I had the full truth. By the following morning, I had reviewed all my notes several times, mentally rehearsing the confrontation I knew was inevitable. Every irregularity, every hidden document, every subtle gesture I had cataloged over the past days built a clear picture in my mind. My daughter-in-law had been manipulating, concealing, and controlling, and now it was time for her to face the truth. I sipped my coffee, feeling its warmth steady me. At 70, I had learned the power of patience, the weight of strategy, and the strength of observation. I called my son into the living room first. His expression was neutral, but I could sense the tension beneath. "I need you here," I said quietly. "I need you to witness something important." He raised an eyebrow, but did not question me. I placed my notebook on the table, opening it to the first pages. Carefully, deliberately, I began recounting the patterns I had observed. Altered calendar notes, Misaligned photos, documents handled differently, the envelope she had taken last week. I mentioned the behaviors I had tracked, the subtle gestures and the discrepancies I had recorded meticulously. My son's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of realization passing over him. "Mom, I didn't realize," he began, but I held up a hand, signaling him to wait. This was not about emotion. It was about facts, evidence, clarity. I then asked my daughter-in-law to join us. She walked in, composed, polite, masking any hint of awareness. I kept my gaze steady, noting every micro-expression, the slight tension in her jaw, the way her fingers tapped against her phone, the subtle narrowing of her eyes, all familiar signals, now documented and accounted for. "Over the past few days," I began, voice calm but firm, "I have observed and recorded a number of anomalies in this household. Some may seem minor, but together they form a pattern of concealment and manipulation." I laid out each observation, one by one, as if I were presenting a case to a jury. The shifted photos, the altered signatures, the hidden envelope, and the discrepancies in the bills. Her expression flickered, almost imperceptibly, but I noticed. There was a tightening around her lips, a subtle hesitation in her posture. My son shifted uncomfortably, glancing between us, finally recognizing the evidence laid before him. "I have confirmed these observations with 2 witnesses outside this household," I continued, keeping my voice measured. "Mrs. Henderson and the housekeeper have both noticed unusual behavior and secretive actions. Their confirmations support the facts I have recorded." I watched carefully, gauging reactions. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick, almost suffocating. My daughter-in-law's voice was controlled, clipped. "Mom, I don't know what you mean." But I saw the brief flicker of panic in her eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening of her hands. It confirmed what I already knew. The evidence could not be denied. I opened the folder I had discreetly secured the previous day. Inside were receipts, notes, and statements, carefully aligned with the observations I had made. This envelope was moved without explanation, and these transactions were made without consultation, I said, laying the documents on the table. My voice remained calm, even, but there was steel underneath. These actions were deliberate. They were meant to exclude me, to manipulate the household, and to conceal intentions from me. She swallowed, her face pale for a moment, and glanced at my son. I could see the realization dawning on him as well. He had not connected the dots before, but now the evidence was undeniable. "I am 70 years old," I continued, letting the words sink in. "I have observed, recorded, and understood what has been happening here. I will not allow manipulation, secrecy, or control to continue without acknowledgement. The facts are clear, and the truth cannot be ignored." I paused, letting my words hang in the room. My grandson sat nearby, playing quietly, completely unaware of the confrontation, a stark contrast to the tension I had orchestrated around him. The innocence of his world underscored the seriousness of mine. Her voice wavered slightly as she tried to respond, but I held my gaze. "This isn't about punishment," I said. "It is about clarity, responsibility, and restoring the household to honesty. You will answer for your actions, explain your decisions, and we will move forward with transparency." My son finally spoke, voice quiet but firm. I see it now. I didn't realize the extent." His acknowledgement was significant. It validated what I had observed and prepared the ground for resolution. I closed the folder, securing the documents carefully. I looked directly at my daughter-in-law and continued, "The choices you have made affect all of us, including the child in this house. Moving forward, there will be no secrets, no hidden actions. Everything will be transparent. That is non-negotiable." The room remained silent for a moment, the weight of the confrontation settling over us. I felt a sense of quiet triumph, tempered by the calm awareness that this was only the beginning of restoring order and fairness. The evidence had been presented, the truth laid bare, and the household could no longer operate in secrecy. I glanced at my grandson and smiled softly, a brief reminder of why this confrontation was necessary. The storm had arrived, and I had met it with clarity, calm, and authority. At 70, I understood the importance of measured action, and today I had taken the first decisive step. The moment after the confrontation, the air felt electric, heavy with tension and the weight of unveiled truths. My daughter-in-law sank into a chair, fingers twisting nervously in her lap, lips pressed tightly together. I could see the panic flicker across her face, a shadow she tried desperately to suppress. She had underestimated me, assumed that 70 years of age meant complacency, passivity, or naivety. She was wrong. My son remained quiet, processing what he had just witnessed. I could see the shift in his demeanor, the dawning awareness of manipulation, the flicker of guilt and shock. He had been blind to the subtle orchestration, but the evidence was undeniable, the truth inescapable. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the calmness of my voice contrast with the storm that had just erupted. From this point forward, I said, everything in this household will be transparent. Hidden documents, secret transactions, and unilateral decisions will no longer be tolerated. Clarity and honesty are non-negotiable. My daughter-in-law opened her mouth, trying to respond, but I held her gaze. She faltered, her voice weak, uncertain. Her strategies, subtle manipulations, and clandestine actions had been laid bare. For the first time, she seemed genuinely aware that her influence was no longer unchallenged. The household had shifted. Even the smallest details, my grandson playing quietly nearby, the dog stretching in the sun, were now seen through a new lens. Nothing could return to the illusion of normalcy until accountability had been acknowledged. I felt a quiet satisfaction, tempered by vigilance. I had presented the facts, demanded acknowledgement, and now the immediate consequences were unfolding. She began fidgeting, glancing repeatedly at the documents I had placed on the table. I didn't mean—" she started, but her words fell flat. My eyes narrowed slightly. I wasn't interested in excuses. The facts spoke louder than explanations. Every movement, every gesture she had attempted to conceal over the past weeks was now undeniable. My son finally spoke, voice low but firm. "Mom, I understand now. I should have noticed sooner. We need to correct this." He nodded toward his wife. "We will fix what we can." His acknowledgement reinforced the shift in the household dynamic. The power I had silently built through observation, patience, and meticulous documentation was now being recognized. I felt a sense of calm authority settle over me. 70 years of life, of experience, had prepared me for this moment. I had witnessed, documented, and analyzed patterns of manipulation, and now the first layer of consequences was visible. My daughter-in-law's usual composure had cracked, her confidence shaken. My son's awareness had risen, and the household's balance of power had begun to adjust. She rose from her chair, slowly, as if testing her footing in a new reality. I'll make changes," she said, voice quiet and hesitant. The certainty in her tone was replaced by caution, a recognition that her previous tactics would no longer work. I nodded slightly, allowing a small measure of acknowledgement to sink in, but remaining firm. Change must be consistent and verifiable. Empty promises meant nothing. I turned my attention briefly to my grandson. His small hands were arranging blocks into towers, humming softly. In the innocence of his world, nothing had changed yet, but the foundation for a safer, more transparent household was being laid. My presence, my authority, my vigilance had ensured that the child would continue to grow in an environment where manipulation and secrecy were no longer unchecked. The documents remained on the table, a silent testament to the truth I had uncovered. Receipts, notes, altered records, all evidence of a careful plan to marginalize me, now cataloged and undeniable. The weight of responsibility was heavy, but I felt a quiet confidence. I had acted with precision, patience, and clarity. The immediate fallout had begun, and the household was responding accordingly. My daughter-in-law paced briefly, muttering under her breath, her previous composure replaced by visible agitation. I observed, noting her reactions in my mind, committing each to memory. Every expression, every hesitation, every subtle sign of panic was confirmation. The truth had disrupted the equilibrium, and the consequences were real. By mid-afternoon, the ripple effects were clear. My son coordinated with me to review household finances openly, ensuring transparency. Conversations previously dominated by subtle manipulation were now monitored, documented, and accountable. The tension in the house was palpable, but it carried a new weight: acknowledgement of truth, recognition of my role, and a shift toward balance. I allowed myself a brief moment to breathe, sipping coffee slowly, feeling the warmth steady me. The storm of confrontation had passed, but its aftermath would continue to unfold. The immediate consequences, my daughter-in-law's anxiety, my son's newfound vigilance, the household's acknowledgement of transparency, were just the beginning. I had reclaimed authority, and the structure I had observed and documented was now taking hold. The dog yawned, stretching lazily, and my grandson laughed softly, oblivious to the undercurrents that now defined the household. I smiled, a quiet, measured smile. The consequences had begun. The balance of power had shifted, and I, 70 years old, had navigated the first stage of restoration with calm, patience, and clarity. By the following week, the household had settled into a tense, fragile routine. The initial fallout from the confrontation had begun to take hold. My daughter-in-law moved cautiously, aware that her previous tactics were under scrutiny, while my son remained attentive, observing every interaction with newfound clarity. But I knew that acknowledgement alone would not secure lasting change. Actions had to follow words. Lessons had to be taught. I spent the early morning with my grandson, quietly observing, guiding him with patience and care. Every smile, every encouragement was deliberate, not just for him, but as a reminder to myself of why I had acted. The stakes were higher than I had imagined. It wasn't only about correcting behavior, it was about protecting the integrity of the family and the household itself. After breakfast, I turned my attention to the household accounts. Carefully, methodically, I began auditing transactions, cross-referencing notes, receipts, and bank statements with my previous observations. I noted discrepancies, transferred amounts, and suspicious patterns. Each finding was cataloged in my notebook, a growing dossier of evidence that confirmed manipulation and reinforced the need for controlled, deliberate intervention. My daughter-in-law approached me cautiously, trying to appear casual. "Mom, is everything okay?" she asked, voice tight, eyes darting toward the documents on the table. I looked up slowly, meeting her gaze with quiet authority. "Everything is fine," I said, "but I need full transparency. From now on, all decisions, all transactions, all communications regarding household matters and finances will be shared openly." She nodded hesitantly, but I could see the flicker of unease beneath her controlled exterior. The lesson was beginning. It was subtle, indirect, but firm. I had reclaimed oversight, and any attempt to circumvent it would be immediately apparent. I scheduled a brief discussion with my son, reviewing the accounts together. "We will not allow unilateral decisions," I said. "Every action must be documented and approved where appropriate. No hidden movements, no undisclosed transactions. The household operates on clarity and trust, not secrecy or manipulation." His nod confirmed he understood, and I felt a quiet satisfaction. The first layer of teaching was in place. Later, as my daughter-in-law attempted to organize a series of minor tasks, I observed and intervened selectively. A document she reached for, previously kept out of my notice, I retrieved and cross-referenced against my notes. I asked clarifying questions in a calm, measured tone. "I noticed this transaction. Could you explain the context? Her hesitancy, the slight trembling in her voice, was telling. I didn't need confrontation here. Her awareness alone was the lesson. Transparency and accountability were now unavoidable. Throughout the day, I monitored subtler cues. Body language, glances exchanged with my son, shifts in tone, and pacing of activities. I recorded each anomaly, each hesitation, reinforcing the notion that concealment was no longer effective. By asserting observation without aggression, I elevated my authority and demonstrated control without creating overt conflict. Evening approached, and I reviewed my notes quietly. I had documented patterns of avoidance, subtle manipulations, and incomplete disclosures. With each entry, I could see how the household dynamics were shifting. My daughter-in-law moved with restraint now, a visible recognition of oversight and consequence. My son engaged actively, questioning, clarifying, and aligning with the principles of transparency I had established. I paused briefly to observe my grandson, whose laughter and focus on building towers with blocks provided perspective. The lessons I was teaching extended beyond immediate accountability. They were shaping the environment in which he grew. He was learning indirectly that honesty, clarity, and respect were non-negotiable foundational values. The strategy was subtle but effective. Teach through presence, oversight, and consistent, calm authority. By late evening, I had cataloged the day in its entirety. Every observed hesitation, every cautious gesture, every moment of compliance and awareness was recorded. The message was clear. I was vigilant, informed, and unyielding. At 70, I had transformed observation into subtle yet undeniable power. I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The storm of confrontation had shifted into a controlled pressure. My daughter-in-law understood, even if only partially, that manipulation would no longer go unchecked. The household had begun realignment. Transparency, accountability, and oversight were now established as norms. The escalation was deliberate, strategic, and entirely within my control. Finally, I looked at my grandson, his small hands busy constructing towers, unaware of the intricate social dynamics unfolding around him. He smiled up at me, and I returned a quiet, reassuring smile. This was why I had acted. The household would function honestly, and the child would grow surrounded by clarity and trust, not secrecy and manipulation. The lessons were set. The consequences were felt. The household now operated under a new equilibrium, one that I had crafted through observation, patience, and deliberate action. At 70 years old, I had asserted authority not through anger or confrontation alone, but through strategy, evidence, and calm determination. The escalation was complete, and the stage was set for the final resolution. The days that followed felt different. The tension in the household had shifted into a steady, controlled rhythm. My daughter-in-law moved carefully, aware that her actions were now observed and recorded. My son, attentive and accountable, engaged fully in decisions that affected the household, and my grandson, blissfully unaware of the subtle maneuvers of adults around him, continued to grow in an environment now governed by honesty, clarity, and respect. I sat in the living room one morning, notebook closed for the first time in days, and allowed myself a deep, steady breath. 70 years had taught me patience, observation, and careful strategy, but nothing had prepared me fully for the satisfaction of seeing the household recalibrate under the principles I had quietly enforced. The storm had passed, and the calm that remained was no longer deceptive. It was deliberate, earned, and peaceful. I reviewed the ledger of events in my mind, the subtle manipulations, the hidden documents, the intercepted communications, and the quiet confirmations from trusted witnesses outside the household. Each piece had been cataloged, analyzed, and addressed with patience and precision. My confrontation, followed by deliberate oversight and the lessons I had enforced, had realigned the family's structure. Transparency was no longer negotiable, and accountability had become the standard. That morning, as I helped my grandson place blocks in neat, towering formations, I felt a quiet sense of triumph. Not because I had punished anyone, but because the household now operated openly, fairly, and with integrity. The lessons had been internalized, subtly but irrevocably. My daughter-in-law approached cautiously, a small smile on her lips, tentative but genuine. She offered explanations and acknowledgments without hesitation, and for the first time, I sensed a sincere willingness to cooperate. I glanced at my son, noting his shift from passive observation to active participation. He had recognized the gaps in his awareness and had begun taking responsibility for decisions, communications, and accountability. The dynamic of our household was now balanced, with clarity and respect at its core. My role as grandmother, observer, and silent strategist had been solidified, not through conflict alone, but through thoughtful, deliberate action. Later that afternoon, I reviewed the financial records again, confirming that all discrepancies had been addressed and corrected. Hidden transactions were explained or reversed, and the household accounts were now fully transparent. Each document and interaction was cross-referenced and verified. I felt a sense of relief, but also of quiet pride. This was not just restoration, it was transformation. I walked through the house, observing my daughter-in-law as she completed her tasks with care and mindfulness. Every movement reflected a new awareness, a recognition that her previous manipulations were no longer effective. I noted her interactions with my son, her attention to household responsibilities, and her engagement with our grandson. Subtle corrections had created lasting impact. That evening, we gathered as a family in the living room. I watched my grandson play with blocks while my daughter-in-law and son discussed plans openly and collaboratively. No secrets, no hidden agendas, no whispered manipulations. The atmosphere was calm but alive, filled with the soft laughter of a child and the warmth of shared purpose. The balance had been restored, and I knew that the lessons, though learned quietly and carefully, would endure. I reflected on the journey over the past weeks, the shock of dismissal, the growing suspicions, the careful documentation, the confrontation, and the deliberate teaching of lessons. Each step had been guided by patience, observation, and strategic action. At 70, I had navigated a delicate, high-stakes situation with clarity, authority, and composure. As night fell, I tucked my grandson into bed. His small hand reached for mine, and I held it gently. In that moment, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The household was functioning openly, fairly, and with integrity. My role had been reasserted, not through anger or conflict alone, but through careful observation, patience, and decisive action. Sitting in the quiet of the house later, I allowed myself to reflect on the lessons of this experience. Age had granted me wisdom, patience, and resilience. Observation had given me insight, and deliberate action had restored balance. The household, once fraught with secrecy and manipulation, now operated with clarity, accountability, and mutual respect. I smiled softly, thinking of my grandson asleep in his room, the dog curled at my feet, and the sunlight spilling through the window. The storm had passed, and in its wake, the household had been transformed. Transparency, honesty, and integrity were no longer negotiable. They were the foundation on which our family now stood. Finally, I reflected on a broader truth. Respect, clarity, and accountability are never too late to enforce, no matter one's age. 70 years had not diminished my ability to observe, understand, or act. And as I closed my notebook for the night, I felt a profound sense of closure, satisfaction, and quiet joy. The household was at peace, my authority restored, and the lessons had been learned.